I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be or whenever you may be listening and watching this video. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I am the co-director of the Center for Ideas in Society and a distinguished professor in the Department of Black Study in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies here at UC Riverside. I want to say it is a special privilege to welcome everybody to this book launch for my friend and colleague, Professor Susan Zieger's just released book, Logistics and Power, Supply Chains from Slavery to Space, just published by UC Press, University of California Press. This event's co-sponsored by the Center for Ideas in Society and the Latino and Latin American Studies Research Center. Please be aware the webinar is being recorded for potential posting on the Center for Ideas in Society YouTube channel. Captions for folks who need them should be available on your Zoom interface. Many universities that have inherited the spoils of colonialism and the trafficking of captive enslaved people routinely introduce campus events with official land acknowledgements. In my capacity, I will not be participating in that practice today. Instead, I join many others who reject institutionalized versions of the university land acknowledgement because we experience it as a normalization and legitimation of ongoing colonial power and violence. I, along with many of you, reject this. Allow me instead to welcome you to this event in the spirit of collective activation rather than passive acknowledgement. Perhaps our time together this afternoon will further inform and inspire us to cultivate forms of study, creativity, relation, and community that will eliminate the need for colonial land acknowledgements at places like the University of California and elsewhere. UC Riverside is a settler colonial institution that occupies unceded land and ecologies continuously inhabited by the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples on and around the campus. In the spirit of this inhabitation, I invoke the shared life work of Rupert and Jeanette Acosta, who devoted themselves to reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence at UC Riverside. Their legacies, including co-founding the American Indian Historical Society and the Indian Historian Press, serve as a constant reminder that Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world are students and workers at this campus. I continue this introduction by honoring Taisha Miller, whose 19-year-old soul was stolen by the Riverside Police Department while unconscious in her car just a few blocks from the UC Riverside campus not long before I started working here. Her absence is a permanent testament to the centrality of anti-Black state violence to this institution and the surrounding geography. I honor the lives and spirits of those seeking relief from the decrepit, extraordinary conditions of carceral torture at the California State Prison in Norco, also nearby, where UC Riverside has proudly and unironically run an accredited college education program. I honor the lives and spirits lost under the supervision of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, with which UC Riverside has a cooperating police relationship. Finally, I honor the lives and spirits of coworkers, students, and surrounding community members who've experienced harassment, intimidation, surveillance, profiling, and criminalization by the University of California's police departments, as well as its administrators, including and especially members of the UC Board of Regents. I humbly offer these words as a reminder of the conditions surrounding the space of today's precious event. I'm honored and privileged to welcome you by calling forward new, old, collective, and experimental efforts to create decolonized, abolitionist, liberated futures. Welcome, everybody. I turn now to an introduction of our speakers. Today's webinar. I'll start with Professor Brett Nielsen. Professor Nielsen's research investigates the intersection of spatial and temporal transformations with contemporary shifts in global economic and political systems. Drawing on cultural and social theory as well as on empirical studies, his work has derived original and provocative means for rethinking a range of critical problems and predicaments, including border proliferation, demographic change, logistical governance, digital infrastructure development, energy transitions, and financial market dynamics. His writings have been translated into 16 languages. Wow. Arabic, Chinese, Finnish, French, German, Greek. I'm just going to take us the rest of the day if I read all of them. Welcome, Professor Nielsen. Welcome, Brett. Jaime Acosta Gonzalez, Dr. Jaime Acosta Gonzalez, is a UC President's postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of California, Riverside. His research focuses on the politics of aesthetics, thinking through how it is that art and literature make visible processes of racialization and accumulation central to the historical development of capitalism. He's currently at work on his first monograph, tentatively titled Landscapes of Dispossession, Latinx Photography and the Administered World, which analyzes a set of contemporary photographers who mobilize the conventions of landscape to critique ongoing forms of primitive accumulation and settler colonialism, representing the emergence of infrastructure corridors, border walls, ex-urban sprawl, and tourist enclaves in Mexico and the United States. Professor Paul Apostolidis is a political theorist in the government department at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His research develops new pathways for critical theory through grounded and engaged studies with Latino migrant workers and other low-wage working people. He's currently writing a book about nighttime labor, social reproduction, and working class politics titled Night Work and the Politics of Freedom, forthcoming in 2027 from Oxford University Press. Professor Apostolidis is the author of The Fight for Time, Migrant Day Laborers and the Politics of Precarity, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. Breaks in the Chain, What Immigrant Workers Can Teach America About Democracy, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2010. And Stations of the Cross, Adorno and Christian Right Radio, published by Duke University Press in 2000, alongside numerous articles. He recently was a visiting expert scholar in the Mellon-funded Latinx Futures Project based at UC Riverside between 2021 through 2025, analyzing environmentally and socially destructive effects of the logistics industry's expansion, as well as Latino community resistance. Professor Apostolidis is the academic lead for the London School of Economics initiatives to expand publicly engaged learning and research opportunities for students. Prior to arriving at London School for Economics, he held the T. Paul Chair of Political Science at Whitman College in Washington State. And finally, perhaps most importantly today, my colleague, my friend, my coworker, Professor Susan Zieger is Professor of English at UC Riverside and the author of Logistics and Power, Supply Chains from Slavery to Space, the topic of our discussion today. She also co-edited The Aesthetic Life of Infrastructure, published by Northwestern in 2023, which won the MLA Prize for Best Edited Volume, and Assembly Codes, The Logistics of Media, published by Duke University Press in 2021. Her first two monographs were on 19th century literature and culture. The two titles are The Mediated Mind, published by Fordham in 2018, and Inventing the Addict, published by University of Massachusetts in 2008. She's published numerous articles, most recently in Social Text, the Journal of Cultural Economy, and Finance and Society, and served as faculty of the Marxist Institute for Research and as a participant in the Supply Studies Network. By way of transitioning into the discussion, I'd like to instigate our dialogue by offering a brief passage from page 7 and 8 of the book that is now being released before passing the mic to our panel of colleagues. It is from page 7 and 8 of Susan's book. Logistical power manages the geography of capitalism, in which the laborers who produce goods are traditionally located far away from the consumers who buy them, the better to prevent the workers' exploitation from creating broader social unrest. The distance between producers and consumers means that goods are always traveling long distances, and they must do so quickly and consistently so that money can change hands and be reinvested to turn larger profits. To enhance the efficient flow of goods, people, and information, logistical power abstracts and obscures non-capitalist values, which register as friction within its systems. Pausing or stopping flows would slow the accumulation of wealth. Because circulation suggests that a community is lively and thriving, its subordination of more human values seems normal. Similarly, to optimize capital, logistical power is always expanding its reach, using novel technologies to branch out into new markets. This growth and flow seems natural because its extractive, obscurely financialized activities go unseen. Its large scale accrues an aura of inevitability. Quietly operating in the background, logistical power creates the market and makes it seem like a given condition of reality. Seeming to make available all the things consumers need and want, it discourages critical questions about its operations. But by constantly moving through places, it tries to reduce them to blank spaces, the anonymous medium of its flows. Living communities of unique people are treated as standardized nodes in a network controlled from elsewhere. When the resulting human and environmental damage becomes more painful than the benefits are pleasurable, people begin to dissent. I think I can think of no better way to pass the mic to our President's postdoctoral fellow, Jaime Acosta Gonzalez, to start the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, for that potent and thorough introduction. And of course, thank you to Susan for the kind invitation to respond to this really illuminating book. It's an honor to be in dialogue with you, as well as with Paul Apostolidis and Brent Nielsen. I've admired all of your work for a long time. So I want to open by acknowledging the absence of a friend, perhaps a friend to many in the audience, and that is Joshua Clover. As many of you probably know, Joshua was an elegant and fearless theorist of the riot and the encampment, which formed part of the repertoire of what he called circulation struggles and what Susan calls counter-logistics. Joshua passed away earlier this year in April, and I'm certain he would have been a spirited participant in these proceedings. We're fortunate enough, however, to be left with a blurb that Joshua provided for logistics and power. And I'd like to read it here, kind of allowing his words to hang in the air as I begin my response. So Joshua wrote, quote, "We can think logistically about the world to the extent that it has become logistical. This book captures that change in flight, a bravura exposition of a world picture coming into view, even as the lineaments of that world, our world, undergo their own sea change," end quote. So I very much agree with Joshua's observation. Logistics and power certainly aims to hit a moving target, tracing the historical leap of logistics from an abstract science of war and circulation into the granular domain of the everyday. That is, all the way up from the organization and securitization of global commodity chains down to the planning of a toddler's birthday party, critically taking up the formation of what Zieger calls the logistical imagination. What I found impressive about Logistics and Power is that it's written with great care and sensitivity, both for its reader, but also for the lives impacted by the violence that efficiency and profit demand. The body chapters explore the reification of flow as a capitalist affect, the logistical nightmare as a euphemism for large-scale crises generated by colonial governance, and the seamless interdependence of legitimate and illicit economies, illuminating the dark side of logistics as part of the capitalist whole, WHOLE. Mobilizing the genre of the supply chain story, Zieger highlights a broad range of historical protagonists that animate logistics' longue-durée march across the globe. These include the merchant, the soldier, the manager, enslaved people, immigrants, in addition to the familiar archetype of the worker. So I want to return to the question of counter-logistics and the latent possibilities it affords. In Capital Volume 1, Marx writes about the process of cooperation, or the necessary process of increasing productivity by combining the labor of many workers in accordance with the plan. This form of labor, Marx argues, transforms the capacities of the individual worker into a new kind of collective social labor. So Marx writes, quote, "When the worker cooperates in a planned way with others, he strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capabilities of his species," end quote. So toward this end, Marx argues that while it is the capitalist who gathers the workers and furnishes them with machines, tools, and raw materials necessary for production, we must not mistake the productive power of social labor for a capitalist invention. He writes, "The socially productive power of labor develops as a free gift to capital whenever workers are placed in certain conditions, and it is capital which places them under these conditions. Because this power costs capital nothing, while on the other hand, it is not developed by the worker until his labor itself belongs to capital. It appears as a power which capital possesses by its nature, a productive power inherent in capital." So anytime I see the word appear in Marx's writing, of course, there's that mechanism of mystification and demystification, the sort of world of appearance and the sort of material reality. That this cooperative power of labor operates as a free gift while activated by the production process it is not a power that belongs to capital. It is only harnessed and controlled by it. And I see a similar line of argumentation taking place in power and logistics, where the expressly human qualities of creativity, connection, improvisation, movement, synchronization, and intellect, among others, are merely appropriated by logistics and are not inherent to it. Um, Zieger argues that, quote, we must hold on to the idea that logistics could function within a differently organized world market in a future after capitalism. Uh, and continues, if we imagine journeying, efficiency, communication, and organization, and human powers with larger horizons than mere profitability, then we will start finding ways to recover logistics for non-capitalist projects. So while logistics over the course of its development as a capitalist strategy of accumulation and motive power relies on the externalization and alienation of human qualities, I read Zieger as arguing that it also offers the prospect of their reappropriation, or a world where logistics and human flourishing are not in themselves in contradiction. Uh, so I guess maybe to pose the first question, I want to ask that while logistics is certainly another name for ruthless efficiency via racialized violence and dispossession, you know, thinking about Marx's understanding of cooperation, what might be the progressive aspects of logistics that point beyond the capitalist mode of production? And how does the concept of counter logistics help us kind of nourish these latent possibilities and think about them? And this attempt to recuperate the fate of logistics resonates with recent theorizations by Michel Fer, for example, who argues for the strategic inhabiting of human capital as a political subjectivity, or even Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's articulation of the entrepreneur of the multitude as a figure that, quote, creates new combinations among already existing workers, ideas, technologies, resources, and machines, end quote. So in the interest of time, I'll sort of just pose one more question. And logistics and power is a sort of global and far-reaching book, and I think it's significant that this event is being hosted, at least virtually, by UC Riverside, located in the Inland Empire, which over the course of the past 40 years has been dramatically transformed by the emergence of the logistics economy. So I want to end by asking about the intellectual standpoint from which logistics and power was written, namely the sort of the experience of teaching in the Inland Empire. This book, which it should be noted is dedicated to Susan's students, seems animated by a sense of urgency that is grounded here. And so I hope we can hear more about that during our discussion. Thank you, and I'll hand it off to Paul.
Thanks, Jaime. It's a great honor to be here with you all. Susan, thank you so much for writing an excellent book and for including me and all of us in this discussion. Thanks, Jaime, for your brilliant comments just now, Brett for being there, Dylan for your eloquent introduction, and everyone who made this call possible in technical terms, and our audience. So there are many aspects of this book that I wish I could talk about, but I'm just going to talk about one right now, given the limits of time. And one that I find especially worth engaging involves Susan's reflections on the role of logistics in shaping relations between capitalism and racial domination. So just this past weekend, I visited an exhibition on slavery and shipping at the London Museum of the Docklands, and I saw a manifest from a slave ship of the sort that Susan has brilliantly analyzed. She interprets these documents as not only enacting the reduction of human beings to nearly dead, logistically manipulable objects, but also as encoding slippages, aporias, and resistances, which betray the ever-present possibility that logistical systems might break down. And this ineliminable threat or prospect of logistical failure is a provocative theme to which Susan returns repeatedly throughout her book. And she proposes that this contingency is not merely an issue of technical functionality, right? It also indicates that opportunities always exist, or at least periodically and dependably arise, for political interventions to challenge the discourses and the institutions through which logistical power operates. To me, the image of Henry Brown leaping out of the box to shake the hands of anti-slavery advocates in Boston to whom he has had himself shipped vividly captures this potential for eluding logistical power or for making it work against itself. And I also really appreciate your insightful discussion, Susan, of the varied and sometimes conflicting implications of the infamous Brooks' ship plan drawings of the side-by-side, row-by-row positioning of African people's supine bodies in the hold of a slave ship. In one sense, Susan argues these famous drawings tended to reproduce the power of military science, which infuses the discourse of modern logistics. I'll just quote a brief passage here. She writes, quote, by illustrating how many enslaved people could be, quote, safely packed into the ship's hold, the diagram enacted a violent logistical practice, the calculation of minimum human needs. The image drew its authority from the genres of scientific and financial diagrams. Though made to expose the horror of the Middle Passage, by representing the logistical quantification of human cargo, it extended it. Susan also sees the diagram's effects for white anti-slavery advocates as ambivalent. So on the one hand, she writes about how the image sparked white outrage at the rendering of human bodies as so much stacked cargo. But on the other hand, quote, the spectacle of enslaved undifferentiation also played to their implicitly racist beliefs that only they could individualize and free Black people. This effect stems from the diagram's God's eye view, which figuratively penetrates the hull of the ship and takes in all its inhabitants in a single sweeping glance. Also, Susan notes, some activists responded to the diagram's publicization by seeking reforms that actually reproduced the primacy of the logistical racial capitalist imaginary that had inspired the slavehold design in the first place. So attempts to reduce enslaved people's suffering on the ship led activists to, quote, negotiate for incremental humanitarian improvements in naval architecture. And so they found themselves caught up in quintessentially logistical debates on the appalling question, quote, how much space does a Black man or woman need to survive? I think that these passages exemplify one of this book's qualities that I greatly admire, which is Susan's insistence that we dwell with the complexities, the internal tensions, and the self-undermining features of logistical networks, narratives, and representations. Where I was hoping the book might go a bit further was in developing its tentative ideas about how to encourage counter-logistical practices and regimes. So this is kind of a question along the lines that Jaime has already articulated, but a little bit different. After I finished the book, I also found myself pondering Susan's claim, bold claim, that telling different logistical stories offers a vital and potent means of contesting globe-spanning logistical power. So I've been wondering, who especially ought to be telling these contrary stories, and to whom, where, and in what venues as priorities? It occurs to me that one spot where a much more complicated, power-conscious story of logistics could be told is in the London Docklands Museum. So I mentioned that shipping ledger from 1811 before, and the text for the display of this item from 1811 reads rather blandly, quote, Urquhart and Hope were among the leading London shipping brokers by the beginning of the 1800s. In this ledger, they recorded the number of Africans carried into slavery in the years leading up to the abolition of the slave trade, end quote. That's all there is. Now, there are multiple layers of self-congratulation here, and being tossed about them made me feel a bit seasick. The pseudo-neutral text intimates pride at the success of, quote, leading London businessmen, which during this age, of course, implies leading the world through the exploits of the British Empire. Susan's analysis of the Brooks diagram also suggests that the blank facticity of this statement about the ledger's recordings subtly encourages admiration for the logistical aptitude of these, quote, leading shipping brokers. And then there's the reminder, always hastily invoked in this country whenever the topic of slavery comes up, that Britain abolished the slave trade, but of course with no comment on how slavery after that kept enabling British wealth to amass. So in short, I find very compelling the idea that we can derive from Susan's book of modifying and complicating the narratives in public places of historical memory, like this museum, which gets a lot of tourists and actually has special exhibitions for children. I wanted to be more compelled by the book's occasional ventures into making prescriptions for political action. So for instance, Susan, in the Dracula chapter, which by the way, I'm kind of obsessed with vampires right now too, so we should talk. You give a riveting account of a young man's body shock after he's been working all night in a refrigerated food warehouse and then plunging into the Southern California heat outside. And then you conclude the section by proposing, quote, advocacy for better practices like, quote, paid cool down times for cold chain workers and incentives to eliminate food waste. So these are obviously desirable policies. But in moments like this, I sense a discontinuity of scale between the multidimensional and vast scope of your critique and your suggestions for rather modest policy adjustments in response. I'm running a book right now about nighttime labor in today's economy, and this project includes examining night warehouse work in the Inland Empire, as well as nighttime farm labor, which is increasing as an adaptation to global warming. I sense some real resonances between our projects, often about the way that concrete experiences can reveal structural power dynamics. For instance, when you write about logistics turning places into blank spaces so that the industry can, quote, trash them, well, like you, I'm thinking and writing about world-leading air pollution levels and respiratory disease in the IE as warehouse development grinds on. A complementary idea that I've had is that logistics expansion is converting nighttime for working class people into just an instrumental segment of a quantitatively organized, homogenized 24/7 workday, draining the night of its qualitative difference for human experience and for non-human existence alike. So in this way, logistics doesn't just try to eliminate the time lags between moments of capital turnover or conquer time by spatializing economic activity. It also fundamentally alters the character of time itself. Policy reforms like tighter air quality standards outside the warehouses, more generous break time for half-frozen or overheated workers inside them, those would, of course, be valuable improvements on current conditions. But the issue then remains of oppositional politics being neutralized by the very logistical discourses that are creating the structural problems of climate change, racial domination, and capital's decimation of organized labor. The problem still persists, one might say, of boxing oneself into asking in the heavily Latino Inland Empire, how much cool down time and space does a brown body need to be able to keep scanning packages? So I wonder what your thoughts are about what I'm suggesting might be, I think there are openings in your book for a bolder, kind of political action to be invoked, and I'm wondering what you think about that. But thanks very much, and I'll pass it over to Brett now.
Okay, thank you, Jaime and Paul, and thank you, everyone involved, and congratulations to Susan. I feel like I've been traveling with this book for a long time. Susan was this side of the dateline. I believe it was 2019 when the writing was beginning. And what struck me from the beginning about this project was really its form and the kind of writerly practice that was being pursued in the patching together of this particular text. And that's a little bit what I want to concentrate on initially today. The method of this text, the way it engages with what Susan calls supply chain stories. I remember back in 2019, Susan was working with short snippets of text, really windows of a couple of pages. And we were all quipping, oh, she's from Los Angeles. This is the minima moralia technique. Then Susan disappeared back on the other side of the dateline, and we had the pandemic, and she came back with a new text. It was more like Moby Dick than minima moralia. It was huge and sprawling and global and planetary and interstellar. Then actually I was one of the readers of this text for UC Press, and the editor tasked me with making some suggestions about how to slim the book down. So now in its current form, let's say it's something more like Dracula, different narrative lines kind of patched together. But, this makes me think that there's a certain literariness to logistics in this text to hit that kind of Russian formalist concept. And I'm thinking about how Susan's work fits into the, evolving body of critical work on logistics at the moment. And I think this is kind of one of the unique contributions that it makes, because a story itself has to negotiate a way of getting from A to B. There's a logistics of putting together a story, and the ways in which stories hang together is really important for the way they work formally and politically. We know this from much work. What I think is happening in this book is precisely that. The whole question of how a story can unfold the connection between the way a supply chain is working, which is complex and fragmented and not chain-like, as we know, and the way capital circulates, and the bodies and places and spaces involved is very much the terrain of this text. Now, my work on logistics has primarily been centered around the activities of the People's Republic of China and the Belt and Road Initiative. I have spent quite a bit of time in the eastern seaboard of China and Taiwan, as well as in India. And one thing that strikes me about the history of logistics from working from these particular sites is that some of the familiar narratives begin to quake. The history of colonialism in these places was not about settler colonialism. It was about concession colonialism. It was about conquest colonialism, where colonizers would come in temporarily, move through, make legal systems and so forth, but often with their own bodies move on or move back to the metropole. I think Susan's work encompasses these dynamics as it deals with the whole logistical origin story of the Middle Passage and of Atlantic slavery. For me, how this story crosses with the stories I know working from those particular places of the world is really important. How it crosses with the whole history of indentured labor in the Pacific, from which we have the origins, for instance, of the White Australia policy in the late 19th century. Thinking about these meshes, which the other two speakers have emphasized, between supply chain management, the circulation of capital, and race bodies, I think there's also an important emphasis on social reproduction in this book, and the way in which reproduction figures through the logistical process. It's interesting to me, the way in which the book works between the ideas of circulation and reproduction. This is to come to a kind of theoretical point, a knot on which I've been working in recent years. Both of these kind of processes, circulation and reproduction, posit a kind of circular movement. We could look at them as tropes, as metaphors, and dig down in that way. However, the approach that I'm working with is more conjunctural at the moment, looking at the movement from the pandemic through to the global regime of war that we have now, in which the supply chain disruption, is a kind of important figure and event through which we can not only tell stories about supply chains, but also empirically research them. You know, the whole idea of the logistical nightmare, the choke point, the place where the supply chain breaks down, has always, in the empirical work that I've done with, you know, various teams of researchers, has provided us with the point of entry, you know, where interoperability does not function between different logistical systems, provides the social and cultural and political researcher with their point of opening. That's where labor becomes highly visible and important as workarounds are engineered. That's where the digital often has to revert to the analog. That's where we see the processes of cultural translation. But also we see the interface of circulation and reproduction with the figure of the and the race figure of the essential worker in the pandemic. If you look at the areas that were essential work in the pandemic, particularly in the global north, they're all areas of circulation, platform work, gig work, health, education, and so forth, either circulation or reproduction. So how do we take this kind of figure of capital and rethink production, rethink modes of production, rethink that important passage from Capital One that Jaime read out? These are some of the questions that I wish to ask. And I also wanted to note another particular aspect that's really important to me in this book, and that is the way in which these stories negotiate so elegantly the relation between abstraction and extraction. You know, these are both hoary concepts with their own history, but we don't think about the relation between them often enough. They both have the traction in there, but they have different kind of prefixes. How they work together, how abstraction can be an extraction and vice versa, but also the tensions between them. It's not that, you know, the abstractions of capital, you know, real or concrete as they are, immediately convert into extractions. You know, between this whole story, there's a question of profit, you know, rather than rent, rather than the, you know, the extraction of something. There's a sense of removal in both of these concepts, removal from some context. When you put the, you know, the widgets into the data unit of the shipping container, you know, it's an abstraction, you know, but when that container circulates through different contexts and moves through the frictions of a supply chain and draws on the various local histories of patriarchy and colonialism through which it passes, it's an extraction. How do we work between these concepts? How do these different tractions, I don't know what to do with that word traction. It reminds me of a broken leg or something. But maybe Susan has some ideas, because you're so wonderful at working with these kind of words and the things they can do once they hit the page. But let me leave it there, and I look forward very much to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Brett, for the comments you just made, and for really sort of championing the book on its path. And thank you to Paul and Jaime for your for engaging the book and for producing these marvelous comments and questions. Thank you, Dylan, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone who is here and listening. And thank you to the Center for Ideas in Society, especially Catherine Henshaw, Jessica DiFilippo, Bianca Lopez. Thank you to the Latino and Latin American Studies Research Center, especially Jaime and David Ariaza. Thank you for Jennifer Doyle, who's going to moderate our questions in a few minutes. And thank you, Jaime, for reading out Joshua Clover's blurb for the book and acknowledging him as someone who is sadly only present with us in spirit. I would have loved for him to be here. Okay. I hope I thanked everybody, and if I missed someone, I hope I remember you before the end. So I think the questions are fantastic, and I'll try to kind of answer them as best I can and as efficiently as I can, so that we have time for the audience to participate with their questions. Where to begin, I think, is in the concept of counter logistics. And so, I'm not the person who invented that term. It's already in the critical literature. And, but I am sort of framing it in the most expansive way. And so the reason for that has to do with the kind of critical gesture of the book is aimed at relatability, so that someone who did not know anything about the topic and has never read Marx could pick up this book and learn about it, without too much difficulty. And so I'm really trying to kind of convey to people, like, what is logistics and how does it operate, and what are some ways that you might take back from logistics the things that it is taking from you. And so to kind of get more specific about, Marx, and for the purposes of this conversation, and thinking about how counter logistics could transform into a post-capitalist logistics, I very much want to hold space and create space for, the kinds of like minor, ad hoc, spontaneous, discovered actions that people could do, and are already doing. So I think about direct aid. I think about, supplying hungry people with food in the park, let's say. MacArthur Park in Los Angeles is my example in the book. Circulating accurate information to sort of debunk a lot of the misinformation that is floating around. Information flows. Getting people to polls is a logistical practice. Like, literally, how do you get someone to go vote, when the policing forces are being arrayed against them, or climate crisis is, causing a flood on election day, or whatever it might be, how do you drive or fly or like help women get the reproductive health that they need when it requires crossing state lines in the United States? Protesting, like the logistics of protesting has changed a lot in the United States and in Los Angeles, like in 2025. How do you get yourself to the protest and stay safe while you're there? How do we help our community members who are being, kidnapped basically and detained? So I think I don't want to like nail down counter logistics and like delineate it when it has to be responsive to things that are happening at every moment. But that said, when I think about it in like a slightly more abstract way, if we're trying to theorize it, Marx in that passage is talking about the rivalry of workers kind of stoking an animal spirits of the workers. He also uses the metaphor of the orchestra, which implies that there's some kind of manager at the top, even if it's you know, for capitalism or not for capitalism, right? It makes me think about like the difference maybe between choreography and social dancing. So choreography is a metaphor that's used quite frequently for logistics, and it's supposed to describe the sort of graceful coordination of, you know, these many moving parts, always from a remote place. And so, you know, the dance troupe leader of, you know, early 20th century industrial dancing, like George Tiller or Busby Berkeley, they're like the names that we remember, and we have no idea who these identical anonymous women dancing in sync were, right? That I feel like is a good model for capitalist logistics. By contrast, I would think about social dancing that has like irregular energies, different social energies, you know, more or less coordination and spontaneity, in person, small scale, local, right? Um, in order to preserve those kinds of values and sort of like kind of refuse to scale them up, um, you know, I think that's kind of where I land. I want to keep it as open as possible. And in this way, I distinguish my sort of gesture from earlier commentators on the debate, for example, between Jasper Burns and Alberto Toscano in the pages of Mute magazine and Viewpoints a little over a decade ago, thinking about how do we resist logistics? Like, could we seize a supply chain? If classical Marxist theory is about seizing the means of production, then how would you seize something where the means of production are sort of strewn everywhere and like you can hardly even locate them? Especially when each person laboring on that supply chain doesn't share the same skills, the same location, the same language, any of it. And so it's a little bit, you know, that's why I feel like the analogy, to go back, Paul, to your example from, you know, the anti-slavery activists who were, you know, advocating for improvements to the slave ship hold. You know, my point is not to hold those people up as like white saviors, you know, to see what they did as revolutionary, because it wasn't, it was reformist. So I think that a lot of counter-logistical activity is going to be like incremental and small scale, and it's going to be advocating for policies that improve a system that we don't like and that is not equitable or fair. You know, that's kind of how I saw it when I was writing the book, and a little bit how I still see it. I mean, now the ground has sort of shifted under our feet. You know, I'm not sure what's going to happen in the coming years in the US, but, you know, I do know that whatever else happens, you know, there's still going to be a room for people to build communities up from small and local efforts into larger institutions. And so that's kind of what I was trying to outline in the book without, you know, kind of making a grander or bolder sort of gesture than that. And again, it's to preserve accessibility so that people can start imagining, oh, like how is logistics operating in my life? And how can I reassert my own values, you know, to kind of get the traction against the abstraction and the extraction. So let me pause there and like ask if any of you, the panelists, want to reply. We can like develop the discussion a little bit, and after that we can go to Q&A from the audience.
Yeah, I can jump in here. So thanks for your responses. And I think, you know, one of the things that struck me about that debate between Toscano and Burns, right, is they're sort of arguing about what they're calling like what was it, the reconfiguration thesis, right? Like whether the infrastructure that is specific to the regime of accumulation that logistics names can itself be salvaged in the name of some kind of future mode of production or some future way of imagining way of inhabiting sort of the world, right? And I think this is a question that to me, like is very resonant here in the Inland Empire because of the sort of density, the sheer density of warehousing here, right? So this is a debate that I often have with colleagues of mine here at UCR. Like, what do we do with all these warehouses? These warehouses are themselves material representations of the kinds of uneven development globally, of the kind of racial domination, right, that is like tied to the development of logistics as a sector, right, that is sort of connecting all of these seemingly disparate locations across the globe. So every space is a global space in this instance, right? Insofar as it is maintained by these material connections to other places. And so, you know, as we're thinking about the sort of the reappropriation, right, of these human qualities that I mentioned, right, creativity, connection, movement, that logistics is in many ways like stealing these things from us, and you're saying we should reappropriate these things back, that the context in which we are trying to reappropriate these things is already in itself a slanted terrain, right? A material geography that sort of is hostile, right, to this kind of reappropriation. And so I think maybe one way of kind of returning back to the question of the Inland Empire, right? And I think Paul actually would have a lot of things to say about this. You're here quite often, actually. Is, you know, I wonder, you know, to the extent that you sort of inhabit the space of the Inland Empire and teach here and are dealing with students. I mean, every first day of class, I have a line of students that come up afterwards, and a lot of them say like, hey, you know, I work the graveyard shift. If I'm falling asleep in class, it's not because I'm not interested, it's just because I'm really tired, right? And this is something that being away, right? When I went to grad school in North Carolina, I was there for about a decade, and I came back, and it seems like in that decade, like the self-identity of the Inland Empire became logistics. Whereas when I left, it was kind of a thing that people talked about, but wasn't really like a sort of part of the self-identity of the place, right? So I think just to kind of frame the question, like, how is it that your sort of standpoint from the Inland Empire is kind of like animating and informing your sense of counter logistics and the possibilities that are embedded in that concept?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me about that question that you asked and for situating it in that way. I mean, so that was very much like your anecdote about like talking to students on the first day of class, and they're telling you that, you know, the logistical work schedule is, you know, contouring their study. Is very much the same as my standpoint in creating the book. When I first started the research, you know, I came at it from my field, which is 19th century British literature. And I was thinking about the novelist Anthony Trollope and the post office, and the fact that Trollope, you know, his day job was working for the British post office, and it was a logistical effort to get the letters into the mail and so on. But what I realized was that I wanted to write a much bigger book, and a book that was rooted in a place that I spend time in for my job, which is the campus of UC Riverside, in all of the contradictions and you know, the haunted kind of history of it that Dylan invoked in his introduction. And so what I did was I did something very unusual for somebody in working in English literature, and I didn't know if I could do it, but I tried, and it was to get IRB approval to interview students and talk to them and collect their stories. And so that's why their stories are in the book. You know, I've changed their names, and, you know, but I'm trying to, you know, hear them talk about their, you know, just what you were saying, like exhausted in the morning, but also like, how do you game the Amazon system? You know, you like hide things on your way to the bathroom and then like scan them on the way back, you know, or like, how do you get around the fact that during the pandemic, they were not allowing workers to talk to each other? You know, which is such a sort of way to squelch collectivization, you know, if I ever heard of one. So I think that to go back to Brett's question about like where do we tell these stories, you know, who's telling them, what is the power of a story? I think that number one, like we want to hear from people who are working in those industries, and also just looking for stories. So I also found there's lots of stories online, like people discuss all of this stuff in forums. I'm used to looking at 19th century novels and poems and things like that. And I find myself like on a Reddit channel and like, and on YouTube, like looking at people's videos that they make where they're describing, what their work is like. So to try to amplify all of that, I think is part of the eclecticism of the book and the fact that it's non-canonical and like doesn't use a sort of standard archive. Like you kind of have to find the archive by looking for it in unusual places. But yeah, I think you're right too. Like when I started teaching at UCR in 2003, like I had a couple students who worked at UPS part-time, but it was not by any means like, the vast majority of student workers seem to be in that industry in one place or another. So I think it did transform during that period. And, your work, Paul's work, Juan Delara's book, The Inland Shift, and the work of other of our colleagues, because UCR has a kind of venerable history of scholarship working on this. Our retired colleague, Anna Bonasic, wrote a book with Jake Ali Mohamed Wilson, who's also co-edited a book with Ellen Reese. Kathy Gudis's work in public history is also related to this. Chris Chase Dunn is a world systems theorist. So, there's like kind of a community here of people who think about these things. And I think that has to do with the regional position too. Okay. Are there other things that we would like to talk about among the 3 or 4 of us? Dylan, if you want to be part of it as well.
Can I just say,
I just think
I thought
maybe Dylan wants to go. Oh,
go ahead,
Paul.
Brett. No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the metaphor of the chain really skews how we think about these issues that we're on now. It's kind of a linear narrative along a chain as some kind of object passes from one site to another. And, we know from ethnographic work that workers at different points along a so-called chain see what they're doing completely differently. They might not even know that they're contributing to the formation and the workings of this so-called chain. So it's really tempting to have the story that one just lays bare, the infrastructure, all the logistical processes, and, solidarities will kind of unfold from that act of revelation. I've always thought it's a little bit more difficult, which is why the question of translation is so important for me in thinking through the way in which these logistical formations operate. And we also have to think about, when we come to studying infrastructures such as warehouses, these kind of vast compendiums of inventory and freight. The objects themselves are moving through different statuses as they come in and out of these places. And these kinds of patterns are not usually organized according to that sort of chain metaphor. I've done a lot of work on data centers where you have the, relations between labor forces are organized according to a servant-client logic that's, spreads across vast stretches of the planet. And there is an infrastructural relation between these workforces if the information that's being processed is on the same server or in the same stack of servers. sitting in a data center somewhere and then mirrored around between others. But it's not adhering to that kind of chain pattern. So the work of creating solidarities, I think, always has to be something more than telling the logistical story. It has to involve that work of translation. And if it doesn't do that, I don't think that this whole kind of critical process in which, most of the people are speaking today is going to have any kind of grip as a political proposition. I also just wanted to mention, given the location of Riverside in Inland Empire and the whole kind of warehousing issue, that we've been doing work on warehouses also across Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia, and particularly looking at the sort of geopolitical ramifications of the different influences of Chinese e-commerce and US-based e-commerce in that space. There are often different software routines involved, for instance, but you can see some of that work on the project site, which is called packetpolitics.space. Don't go there now, but I just wanted to register that in the hope of ongoing dialogue with people working on Inland Empire.
Can I say something quick? I agree with what you said there, Brett, about the way that just, revealing the operations of supply chains won't of itself, suddenly catalyze solidarity, that forming solidarity is something that has to be more intentional. It's a more protracted process. And I like this idea of translation. And then Susan, I really loved what you said at the start of your comments about, the aim of trying to take back or trying to think about how people can take back from logistics what logistics has taken from them. And yeah, I totally agree that if part of what logistics is seizing is the specificity, the idiosyncrasy of local place-specific cultures, that trying to recover those things or save them is crucial. But it also makes me want to think about solidarity when I think about, what's been happening in the Inland Empire recently with just ongoing warehouse development. Think about the struggle in Bloomington that, was waged in some pretty heroic ways with pretty large scale community mobilizations, but hasn't really been able to stop the process going forward of destroying people's neighborhoods. And so I think, one place can't do it for itself. Like there have to be methods of constructing solidarities. I think probably not just between like Bloomington and Miraloma, but also between like the Inland Empire and the LA region, for whom most of the products that are churned out of the warehouses are being destined for delivery because of the class division between these regions in Southern California. So I don't have the answer to that, but it makes me think more in terms of solidarity in the sense of a hegemonic project that does try to scale up. And I don't know, I thought I detected in your book a desire for that. But maybe I read it wrong that way.
I mean, I would love to have a way to think of a scaled up, kind of solidarity. I do think that when you're in internet forums full of, let's say, Amazon workers complaining about their conditions, like because the fulfillment centers are pretty identical in structure, right? Of course, inhabited by local workers, right? But there is an opportunity for workers in the different places to relate to each other because a lot of what they experience is this, the same sort of techniques. I want to make sure Dylan gets to say something. And also I want to make sure that I remember to thank you for the introduction, because that was so important, and I'm grateful for you giving it.
No, I mean your book just echoes back, the fraction of stuff that I tried to bring into the context for the discussion and the introduction. Well, first of all, let me remind folks who are attending in attendance that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom interface to submit questions. And I'm sure the panelists will, be eager to take them on. I had a question for the four of you to take on however you wish. But as I'm listening to you talk and thinking about the conditions, the prospects, the limitations, the dilemmas around whatever it is that we call solidarity, because I'm increasingly asking questions about what the hell we mean by that when we say it, right? I don't think we can assume, a kind of unity of conceptualization, much less strategy around what solidarity actually is. I'm wondering how the work all of you are doing, but Susan, particularly you, that you're doing around this logistics regime, especially in the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino County, et cetera, help us with another angle of analytical and theoretical insight into state terror. And I'm thinking in particular about the overlap, which I don't think is incidental. I don't think it's even scandalous. I think it's systemic. I think it's logical between this logistics regime and something like the militarization or proliferation of ICE. And that's what I mean by state terror, right? The kind of relentless pursuit, which is gendered and racial, of particular kinds of workers who significantly overlap with the workers that we are talking about in these different geographies of Inland Empire logistics, of the Inland Empire logistics apparatus. I'm just curious if you all have anything that can help me and others think about the role of the state in this particular mobilization of the state in what I think is probably a conjunctural moment, which also resonates with other conjunctural moments in which the state mobilizes an apparatus of terror against particular kinds of workers.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say quickly, because I know my panelists will have more to contribute. Ted Lyons, the director of ICE, in July said that ICE needed to get better at quickly and efficiently deporting people, and it needed to develop a system that was, I'm paraphrasing, like Amazon Prime for humans. And so, they're actually emulating the FedEx model in Louisiana of like a hub and spoke, where people who have been kidnapped are like brought to a facility in Alexandria where the plane lands and the detention center is on the tarmac. They're kept in the detention center, and then the idea is that whenever the processing happens, they're put back on flights and sent out of the country. And so that feels to me like the clearest conjunction of the way that this logistical model is moving from, formally moving from the corporate sector into state terror, like you're describing.
Hi, it's Jennifer here helping to moderate, and I just wanted to put on the to share a question that seemed related, Susan, to what you had just said, which is a question from Marge, and I'm not sure how to say your last name, but I'm going to guess Kinkead. Has anyone done work on the logistics of deportation and integration into new countries? Or if you have any ideas about what's sources that people might turn to learn about this issue. There's another question, but I'll let you answer that and continue discussion and bring that one in.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Marge. I don't know if anyone has yet done research on, what has just happened in the last few months of people landing in countries that they have no relationship to, like the third country, right? Not their country of origin. What is happening to them there? It's an awful, it's a heinous kind of way of punishing people by sending them to somewhere that the US State Department doesn't recommend that free people travel to because it's too dangerous. So it's a kind of grotesque new sort of punishment, that is happening. I don't know, maybe other people have insight into that.
I'd like to plug the work of my friend Hillary Goodfriend, Paul knows Hillary. Hillary was actually a postdoc at UCR a couple years ago, and Hillary writes about kind of nearshoring and the way in which kind of like people from El Salvador who have been deported but actually have grown up mostly their entire lives in the United States are like reabsorbed into the call center economy in El Salvador because of this kind of cultural capital that they have, speaking English, the sort of like Americanization that they possess, that they are then sort of like, she calls it recycling, right? So they're not just actually disposable, they're actually recycled back into this global economy. And secondly, to Dylan's point, about state terror, I think Justin Akers Chacon is a great thinker of this. He sort of refers to the state as the migra state. And essentially what he's referring to is the idea that, Geo Group or Core Civic donate millions of dollars to, Republican candidates. Then Republicans mobilize ICE as essentially as like a mechanism to fill these detention facilities to then pad the profits, right, of these corporations. And there's something to be said about the fact that this has become a domain of profit seeking, right? That this kind of repressive accumulation by repression is often, sometimes what it's called. That this has been a sort of a mechanism, right, for activating this kind of relationship or collaboration between the state and these repressive apparatuses as a way of generating profit for these detention center facilities and corporations that run private prisons.
In terms of people who have written about logistics of deportation, the work I know is mostly in migration studies, but there's a lot of work that takes the lessons of critical logistics studies. People like Martina Tazzioli working from Italy. In a couple of mornings, I'm in another webinar from Mexico City called Migration Governance and the Production of Violence with Nicholas de Geneva and others who've written extensively on deportation. But I want to come to Dylan's question about state terror. I've not been living in the ambience of ICE from a distance. And clearly there are things to say about that in terms of, the kind of political and ideological function that this particular part of the state apparatus is assuming in the United States at the moment. But to come to the question of terror, for me, analytically, this is really importantly related to the incapacity of the state to guarantee the reproduction of capital and the production of labor and social reproduction within a kind of bordered setting. It seems to me that it makes a lot of sense that when the state is unable to manage this kind of what Marx called Gesamtkapital, Engels talked about the state as the ideal capitalist actor, or I'm not getting the quote right. I'd have to go back to my notes. But it seems to me that it makes sense that when the state loses control of this capacity, you have on the one hand this kind of terroristic action against the most vulnerable, and on the other hand, you have a kind of geopolitical dynamic operating at the more global or planetary level, where you have growing hostilities between different poles of power within the world. So I see these things as very much related precisely around that analytic of capital circulation and reproduction. On the question of solidarity, I won't unfold it now, but I think it's important to mention that when we talk about solidarity, we're usually talking about solidarity between workers' solidarity on the left, but I also think there are important forms of solidarity that are operating on the political right at the moment. And I don't think that solidarity is a phenomena or a kind of relation that applies only on the left.
If you don't mind, I'll share a couple things that have come up on the chat. One is a response to Susan, Brett, and Jaime and on the recent discussion, and not a question. So I'll just share that and then read the question, which is a shift in subject. This observation comes from Aleka LeBlanc. This is not a question, but an observation. I'm surprised to learn that DHS and ICE are deploying the Amazon or FedEx hub and spoke model, because in those systems, goods and packages can be easily and accurately tracked by the vendor, the shipper, and the customer, whereas in the public-facing versions of these systems, there seems to be no logic or ability to track and find people, which is, of course, feels quite intentional. I want to share the question that was posted by Jorge Poveda. I was happy to hear the analogy with choreography and social dance, because rarely do we analyze the different systemic and industrial shifts in corporeal terms. For instance, Fordism was a saliently corporeal regimentation of the worker's body. In view of this, how do you, Susan, imagine the counter-logistics body to be? And I think these two the comment and the question actually resonate with each other.
Yeah, thank you for reading those, and thank you to the questioners and commenters. I mean, what I think of when I think of, you know, the logistical subject, there's this convergence in warehousing, and especially in Amazon, where the human workers are still there being paid, you know, exploitative wages. Their labor is becoming more robotic. Like, they're asked to sort of stand still for long periods, and like picking items out of a giant shelf that a robot moves towards them. Right. And so there's a way in which they are becoming more like kind of static and immobilized, like the robots that are, you know, giant arms that are, you know, swatting packages down certain chutes, right? Meanwhile, the robots are supposedly acquiring like more human capabilities. So there are now humanoid formed robots, which have even recently been given heads to make and like a slight sort of randomness in their gait, so that they are less uncanny and disturbing to the humans that they work with. Who are, you know, these robots are sort of doing tasks that humans used to do, but like both are still there in the warehouse. And so, you know, there was a very offensive quote that I put in the book from an Amazon official who described the robots rolling off the production line and as a graduation. And the robots, you know, will sort of move their tassel from one side of their cap to the other and like go off to the factory to work. And, you know, meanwhile, my students are working really hard in the warehouse, you know, as humans. Okay, so you sort of see this convergence of physically, like how the taxing difficulty for humans to replicate the automation of a robot, because our hands and our brains are not designed to do the same thing in machinic precision, you know, forever. So I think that a counter logistics of the body, like, I would really insist on it being like kind of not controlled and formulated, and to let it be spontaneous and expressive and useless even, you know, like I sort of almost don't even want to describe it, and like just make it the anti-choreography. This is a little bit speaks to the question of, you know, wellness discourse sort of talks about resting and recharging, right? But of course, the whole reason is to revive yourself so you can go back to work. And so I think we need like a kind of way of being physically at rest or in motion that is not going to be recuperable, for productivity.
The sports studies scholar has all kinds of things to say about that. So,
Please jump in if you feel like it.
well, only just that. I think that from the standpoint of working with physical culture and movement, it's you sure like rest, stillness, and the like is one avenue to go for thinking about the way the body might be outside these things, but there other ways of thinking about how people train themselves and each other, and work together physically, and actually learn and absorb things into the body as a kind of routinized forms of knowledge, right? That I think that might be a potential area for thinking from a movement-based kind of perspective about counter logistics, kind of like the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu version of your book. We have a couple questions coming up here, and they're a bit meaty, so I'm going to distill one, which is from Giovanna Isevsky, and I'm going to just jump in and read the other in the interest of making sure they're both put on the table. One was a straightforward question about the place of early computer technologies and newer predictive algorithmic models in your work, and a question about whether these also might operate as a site for reclamation and thinking about counter logistics. And then the second question is coming from my motherland, New Jersey. This is Liana Katz, and they're writing in from New Jersey, where we have seen ICE conducting raids on bonded warehouses serving the port of New York, New Jersey. This is a direct overlap of logistics and deportation networks. Beyond this, the majority of non-Amazon logistics workers here in New Jersey are temp workers who are often undocumented immigrants. Temp agencies and the logistics companies that hire them use workers' precarious immigration status to reproduce the temp workforce, and therefore the logistics workforce. This person has not read your book, but is very curious about the degree to which Amazon has become synonymous with contemporary logistics networks, and whether or how other types of warehouse and logistics spaces offer insight into a different type, not necessarily better, of labor and capitalist geography. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for reading both of those out. To take the second one first, I mean, it is easy to kind of slip into saying Amazon, for the whole industry, because they're an industry leader, I guess, not in a positive way, but like in terms of, having kind of revolutionized e-commerce, and, done that through these exploitative techniques. But I did hear from a lot of students who worked not in Amazon, but in less formally and technologically advanced spaces. Some warehouses can be quite small, and it's so it's the same but different, right? It's there is perhaps more room, less algorithmic coercion. But by the same token, there's also less, I don't know. I mean, Amazon like still has, a complaint route and like an HR system, and right, other, sort of more mom and pop systems like don't necessarily have all of that. They're less digitized, so the coercion probably takes a different form than just having to kind of route everything through the app that controls your paycheck and whatever else may be happening. Paul has some comments about that.
What you just said, Susan, made me think of so I did a program of interviews too with warehouse workers, most of whom were young, many of them students at UCR, and most of them were at Amazon. And what I heard, and I'm curious if you came across this too, Susan, was that there was a kind of a hierarchy among the warehouses where that related to people's immigration status. So that the people who you found at Amazon warehouses tended to be younger, tended to be legal residents of the United States and mostly born in the U.S. Whereas their parents or relatives who were undocumented would tend to be employed in smaller warehouses, less with, fewer of those avenues for, complaint or for, any kind of grievance process than you would have at Amazon. And there was this way where, as bad as things are as Amazon, with health and safety, with the roboticization of jobs and everything, it was still viewed as a kind of step up from warehouses that were just physically dirtier and where employers and supervisors were more abusive, according to what the interviewees told me. Did you hear something? And that kind of gets to your point too, Dylan, about state terror and the mapping of the deportation system onto warehouse logistics.
That definitely tracks with my research. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Can I come in? Yeah, I just wanted to say that from my perspective, Amazon is not synonymous with contemporary logistical networks. Working in Southeast Asia, Amazon has distinct problems in market penetration because of their vertically integrated ownership and logistical model. And they have real problems doing last mile delivery in countries like Vietnam. The model of Alibaba, Sinow, which is not vertically integrated, which emphasizes more partnerships with local companies, is much more effective in making those last mile deliveries in that part of the world. I think that's a significant, not only empirical, but analytical point. But I also want to twist this around to the conversation about terror and solidarity, taking a tip from a conversation I recently had with Zhang Biao, the Chinese anthropologist now based in Halle in Germany, who tells me that he's working on the problem of the first mile in China. What is the first mile? From where we sit, from where we act, or from which, the first mile in China from where you have the so-called factory of the world, but stuff has to get out into the logistical networks. I think the question of the first mile might be a very good one to ask with respect to these questions of political solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, the first mile is the mile that most people really don't want to see, right? It's like the mysterious like ether from which raw materials and, like partly finished products come. I think, and that's where, there's a lot of hype around, first it was blockchain and now it's AI, and it probably will be quantum computing to sort of see like all the end to end of the supply chain. And this goes back to your point about how that chain metaphor is as obscuring as it is elucidating. But to go back to the beginning of the chain, I don't think companies actually want to know what goes on there. Most companies like can't see past a couple tiers of their suppliers, and I think it's partly because they don't want to know, and consumers and governments don't want to know either. So it'll be interesting to see what your friend uncovers there, and surely like it's a crucial question for solidarity. And I also take your point about like informal networking, especially in Southeast Asia and the Far East, like that, if we look at the world systems theory of the phases of capitalism, like it feels like that is the model, whereas Amazon is still like maybe the last gasp of the American, corporate managerialism. Just to throw that out there.
Hi. Things got a little glitchy for me for a second. So there's just another question from Alfonso Gonzalez Toribio from the Latino and Latin American Studies Research Center. This question is asking you about opportunities and contradictions that reveal themselves in the face of the nationalist recoil away from global free trade, and as we see with tariffs, for example. What becomes of logistics hubs and workers in the face of a decline or a crisis in global trade?
I mean, my observation about this is the general sense that, the Trump administration is trying to kind of grab logistical power and like control globalized supply chains that, and shake down countries for fees to play, right? So it's a protectionist regime. I don't know that that's actually going to that is leading to problems for small and medium-sized businesses in the United States, but I'm not sure if that is going to actually cause a decline in global trade, or if all of those supply chains are going to use the nimbleness that they've cultivated to reroute themselves around the United States instead. I'm not sure that it's certainly the plan to kind of recreate manufacturing in the United States through that method is not going to happen. So I don't, in combination with the expulsion of workers, it feels like bad economic decisions. I don't know. I'm gonna let other people reply on that one.
I would just say it does seem like it's a real issue. When I was in the IE last time, I think it was people at the Environmental Justice Organization, CCAEJ, with whom I was talking, who had these figures of massive declines in the numbers of containers that were arriving at the ports as a result of the tariffs. Something like 30% down was what this was back in April that I was there, and they were saying that people were predicting that in the summer it would be, there would be and later on as 2025 progressed, there really would be declining volumes of shipments coming in. So I don't know how to answer Alfonso's question, but I think it's a good one. And there is something that's being disrupted in the sort of effort of the supply chains to just ever be sort of circulating ever increasing volumes of goods.
Yeah, I think it's a good question too. I think that protectionist stances are also to do with what Susan says about trying to control supply chains and the kind of operative global spaces that come with them. I think it's worth also just glossing the question of energy in this regard. How are the the container ships and so forth being fueled? Because part of the way in which this is changing in the conjuncture is the emergence of different energy systems. So the whole question around EVs, around batteries, around the prevalence of those kinds of commodities in the People's Republic of China, around the emergence of two kinds of rival energy systems, one based on fossil and one based on renewables increasingly, although it's never an easy transition, is a really important one to sound in this whole issue of control over these global operative spaces. I think it's also important to keep an eye on the connections that remain, even between sworn political and geopolitical enemies in this kind of scenario. So the shutdown is often selective, and we have to keep an eye on those things that are still moving as other things shut down and have their implications on places and workforces.
There are no new questions in the Q&A, just sharing that.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Did anyone want to address anything? Did we miss anything that needed to be addressed or said? I want to make sure to once again thank everybody for being here, to thank Dylan for the amazing introduction to this, not just to me and my book, but to the place and to the topic, and to thank Jaime, Brett, and Paul very much for their contributions to this incredible conversation. It looks like Catherine is here and needs to say something.
I just wanted to say thank you to you all, Susan, and chiming in here as a last comment. I'm sorry, I was slow to unmute myself when you invited folks for a last comment. I wanted to say that we had a special treat. We have a couple of copies of your book. And so we created a small little pool out of the folks who submitted questions in the Q&A. And so I'm really happy to share that Giovanna Isevsky and Liana Katz both won copies of the book. So I'll be following up with them later. Congratulations to them both. And I'm sure they will enjoy reading it and perhaps even have more questions for you later when they cross paths with you. So congratulations.
Thanks, Catherine. And that is like a lovely tradition of CIS to give away the books for the book launch events. And so Jennifer, you have another.
Yeah, there's another comment just came in, which I thought you'd really love to hear. This is from Amber Valles. Amber, I feel like you might have taken a class with me too. So no question here, just a comment. I'm a UCR alum here. Thank you for sharing the wonderful discussion and congratulations to Dr. Zieger on her new book. I've spent the last 10 plus years working in third-party monitoring, auditing supply chain networks and focusing on worker rights. I appreciate the connections made here, especially the points made on abstraction and extraction. As everyday consumers, we don't immediately think of the background of logistics, its impacts, and really the chain reaction of chaos it has on our communities, environment, and collective well-being.
Thank you, Jennifer, for reading it. Thank you, Amber, for making that comment and for being here. And I'm really thrilled to let your comment be the last word of the day. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions.
Yeah, thanks, and congratulations.
And good to see you all.
Good to see you too, Brett.